The Exelther Dominion had ruled the stars for centuries, crushing weaker civilizations under their iron grip. Their fleet was the largest, their weapons the deadliest, and their arrogance unmatched. When they received reports that a lone human warship had entered their sector, they didn't see it as a threat. They saw it as entertainment. Admiral Korthax, the commander of the Exelther fleet, sneered as he watched the tiny human vessel on his holographic display. It was laughable, one ship against thousands. His officers chuckled, exchanging amused glances. The humans were either foolish or desperate. Either way, this was going to be over soon. Korthax activated the fleet-wide communication channel and broadcast his words directly to the human ship. "Little creature, you are either lost or delusional. Surrender now, and I promise to make your end quick. Fight." Laughter erupted across the Exelther ships as their weapons locked onto the human vessel. They expected fear, panic, maybe even a desperate attempt at retreat. But the response they received was nothing like they had imagined. Inside the human warship, Admiral Riker remained calm, his fingers resting lightly on the command panel. His crew was silent, focused, waiting for his order. The Exelther thought they had already won, but they had no idea what they were facing. Humanity had been underestimated for far too long. Riker activated his own transmission, his voice cutting through the static like steel. "Admiral Korthax, you talk too much. Let's see how well you fight." And with that, the human ship fired the first shot. It wasn't a warning shot. It wasn't a desperate attempt to cause damage before being destroyed. It was a single, devastating beam of energy that cut through space like a blade, piercing the Exelther flagship as if its shields didn't even exist. There was no explosion, no debris, just a moment of silence before the Exelther's pride and command vessel disintegrated into nothing. For the first time in centuries, the Exelther fleet was silent. The laughter had died. Confusion spread among the alien warships as officers shouted for reports, struggling to understand what had just happened. How could one human weapon bypass their defenses so easily? Before they could react, the human ship moved again, impossibly fast for a vessel of its size. More beams of energy shot out, each one striking a target with terrifying precision. Battleships that had once terrorized entire civilizations were being erased from existence in seconds. Panic set in as Exelther ships scrambled to reposition, but it was already too late. The human warship wasn't just powerful, it was unstoppable. Admiral Korthax, second in command, Captain Rolthak, tried to rally the fleet. "Fire everything. Overwhelm it," he screamed, his voice shaking. The Exelther ships unleashed a storm of plasma torpedoes, energy lances, and kinetic projectiles. But the human ship didn't even flinch. Its shields absorbed the attacks like they were nothing more than raindrops on steel. It twisted and turned through the enemy formation with impossible agility, avoiding incoming fire as if it could predict every move before it happened. One by one, Exelther warships fell, torn apart by the precise and devastating attacks of the lone human vessel. The battlefield was no longer a fight, it was a massacre. Watching the destruction unfold, Korthax felt something he had never experienced before: fear. The Exelther Dominion had faced many enemies, but never one like this. Humanity was supposed to be weak. They were supposed to be inferior. But now, as his once mighty fleet crumbled around him, he realized the truth. The humans had been hiding their true strength all along, and now they had chosen to reveal it. With his fleet reduced to wreckage, Korthax had no choice. "Retreat!" he roared, his voice shaking with desperation. The surviving Exelther ships turned and fled, abandoning their fallen comrades in a desperate attempt to escape the nightmare unfolding before them. As the last of the Exelther warships disappeared into the void, Admiral Riker leaned back in his chair, watching the battlefield grow still. His crew remained quiet, processing what had just happened. The Exelther had come expecting an easy victory. Instead, they had been shattered, their arrogance turned to dust. Humanity had sent a message, one that would echo across the galaxy. They were no longer to be mocked, no longer to be ignored. They were here to stay. and those who stood against them would learn the same lesson the Excelthor had just learned: humanity does not bow. The Excelthor fleet had never known fear. Their empire had crushed countless worlds. Their warships had burned entire civilizations to ash, and their dominance had never been challenged. When they saw a lone human warship enter their territory, they didn't prepare for battle. They prepared for amusement. Thousands of Excelthor officers laughed aboard their mighty vessels, watching the small, insignificant human ship drifting into their space. It was nothing but a single dot against the vast darkness, surrounded by the monstrous fleet of the Dominion. The Excelthor had spent years mocking humanity, calling them weak, primitive, unworthy of standing among the stars. And now, as this single vessel floated before them, they saw it as nothing more than a final joke. Admiral Korthax, the highest-ranking commander in the Excelthor fleet, grinned as he leaned forward in his command chair. "Open the transmission. Let's hear what this creature has to say before we erase it." His voice dripped with arrogance, his golden armor reflecting the eerie glow of the warship's control panels. The transmission link was established, and the image of a human officer appeared on the massive holo screen. Unlike the Excelthor, he was not smiling. His face was calm, his eyes cold, his posture unwavering. "Human, you have entered Excelthor space," Korthax declared, his voice echoing through the transmission. "You are outnumbered. You are outgunned. And you are out of time. Surrender your ship, and we might allow you to live as a slave. Fight, and we will ensure no trace of you remains." The laughter of the Excelthor officers filled the air, their voices mocking and cruel. The human officer did not react. He simply stared, his expression unchanging. Then, after a long silence, he spoke. "Admiral Korthax," his voice was steady, controlled. "You talk too much." Before the Excelthor could process the meaning of those words, the human warship Fire.it was not a desperate, reckless attack. It was not a plea for survival. It was a calculated, precise, and devastating strike. A single beam of energy, silent and swift, cut through the darkness of space and struck the Excelthor flagship with unthinkable force. There was no explosion, no fire, no debris scattering into the void. There was only a blinding flash, and then the Excelthor's most powerful warship was gone. One moment, it had been there, towering over the battlefield, its weapons primed and ready to annihilate the human ship. The next, it was erased from existence, as if it had never been there at all. The laughter of the Excelthor fleet died in an instant. A wave of confusion swept through the enemy ships. This was impossible. Their shields were impenetrable. Their armor was the strongest in the known galaxy. No enemy had ever destroyed a Excelthor battleship in a single strike. And yet, the human warship had done just that. Panic spread like wildfire. Officers shouted over one another, demanding explanations, searching for answers that did not exist. The human vessel did not wait. It moved with terrifying speed, shifting across the battlefield like a phantom, dodging incoming fire before it even began. More beams of energy cut through the void, each one finding its mark with ruthless precision. Another Excelthor warship vanished. Then another. And another. Admiral Korthax, who had spent his life watching enemies crumble before his might, now sat frozen in his chair. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, were wide with disbelief. He had thought this battle would be a mere formality, a quick and effortless execution. Instead, he was witnessing the utter destruction of his fleet. "What? What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What kind of weapon are they using?" No one had an answer. The Excelthor's strongest attacks were worthless. Their missiles exploded harmlessly against an unseen force. Their plasma cannons failed to lock onto the target. It was as if the human ship knew their every move before they made it. The mighty fleet of the Dominion, the terror of the galaxy, was being wiped out. Across the battlefield, surviving Excelthor officers made a desperate decision. "Retreat!" The cry spread from ship to ship, commanders abandoning all sense of pride as they turned and fled. Never before had the Excelthor run from battle. Never before had they known true fear. But today, they had encountered something beyond their understanding. Something they had underestimated. Something they could not stop. The human ship did not pursue. It remained where it was, silent and unmoving, watching as the Excelthor forces scattered into the abyss, their once mighty fleet reduced to wreckage and retreating vessels. Inside the human warship, Admiral Riker finally exhaled, his expression unchanged. "Status report?" he asked. "All systems optimal," his second-in-command replied. "The enemy is in full retreat." Riker nodded. "Good," he said. "Thought they were invincible. They had thought humanity was weak. They had been wrong. And now the entire galaxy would know that the first shot fired by a human warship was also the last shot their enemies would ever hear. Panic had taken over the Excelthor fleet. The battlefield that had once echoed with their laughter was now filled with frantic orders and desperate attempts to escape. The humans whom they had mocked, whom they had seen as nothing but weak creatures unworthy of standing among the stars, had revealed a power beyond their worst nightmares. The lone human warship moved like a phantom through space, evading enemy fire with impossible speed and striking with terrifying accuracy. Every time it fired, a Excelthor warship vanished. It didn't explode. It didn't break apart. It simply ceased to exist, erased by a weapon unlike anything the Excelthor had ever encountered. Their mighty shields, their advanced armor, their powerful countermeasures, none of them mattered. Against this human ship, they were nothing. Admiral Korthax stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists as he watched his fleet crumble before his eyes. This wasn't just a battle, it was a massacre. He had fought in countless wars, had destroyed civilizations that dared to stand against the Dominion, but never had he seen an enemy like this. His officers shouted around him, demanding orders, but what could he say? What could he do? Every tactic they had used, every weapon they had deployed had failed. The human warship didn't just fight it predicted. It countered their every move before they even made it. It was as if it knew exactly how they would respond and was always one step ahead. And the worst part? The humans were not in a rush. They were taking their time watching as the once mighty Excelthor armada fell apart piece by piece. A desperate captain from one of the remaining Excelthor warships attempted to rally his forces. "Surround it. If we attack from all sides, we can overwhelm its defenses." A handful of surviving ships obeyed, closing in from all directions, their weapons primed for a final, desperate assault. Plasma cannons, missile salvos, energy lances, every weapon they had was fired at once, creating a storm of destruction that should have been impossible to escape. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the impossible happened. The human warship didn't dodge. It didn't raise its shields. Instead, it unleashed a wave of energy that expanded outward, passing harmlessly through empty space, but striking every Excelthor vessel around it. In an instant, the attacking ships lost power, their engines dying, their weapons shutting down, their shields flickering out. They drifted helplessly in the void, their crews trapped inside, powerless and defenseless. And then, with precision and finality, the human ship fired again. One by one, the Excelthor warships were erased, their captains never even getting the chance to react. Korthax felt his breath catch in his throat. This was not a battle anymore. This was the end of the Excelthor Dominion's dominance. The empire that had ruled the stars with fear was now the one trembling in terror. The human warship had barely taken any damage, had barely even tried, and yet, the Excelthor's mightiest fleet was being wiped from existence as if it were nothing more than an afterthought. Korthax gritted his teeth, his pride screaming at him to fight, but his instincts telling him the truth. There was no victory here. There was no escape. There was only survival, and only if the humans allowed it. All remaining ships, he growled through clenched teeth, retreat. Now, across the battlefield, the few surviving Excelthor ships turned and fled, their once great forces now reduced to scattered, terrified remnants. The Excelthor, who had never known fear, were running for their lives. But the human ship did not pursue. It simply remained where it was, watching as the last of the Dominion's warships disappeared into the void. It could have destroyed them all. It could have wiped out every last one of them. But it didn't. And that was what terrified Korthax the most. The humans had made their point. They hadn't come to beg for mercy. They hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to show the Excelthar and the entire galaxy what they were capable of. And now, everyone knew the truth. Inside the human warship, Admiral Riker exhaled slowly, watching the battlefield grow quiet. His crew sat in silence, processing what had just happened. The Excelthar had underestimated them. They had believed themselves to be the rulers of the galaxy. But now, they understood the truth. Humanity was not weak. Humanity was not to be ignored. They had not started this war, but they had just finished it. And now, as the wreckage of the once mighty Excelthar fleet drifted through space, one thing was clear. A new power had risen among the stars, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The silence after the battle was deafening. Wreckage from the once mighty Excelthar fleet drifted aimlessly through space, glowing embers of destroyed warships casting eerie shadows in the void. The unstoppable war machine of the Dominion, which had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, now lay in ruins. The surviving Excelthar vessels had fled, their commanders too shaken to fight. But even as they retreated, they knew this was not just a defeat. This was a turning point. The illusion of Excelthar invincibility had been shattered. Their enemies, once afraid to resist, would now rise. And the cause of this destruction? A single human warship. Aboard the remaining Excelthar battleships, fear gripped the officers. The battle had ended, but the nightmare was far from over. Admiral Korthax, his golden armor now smeared with the soot of failure, stood motionless, his sharp eyes locked onto the holoscreen. He watched the human warship, a small but terrifying figure against the backdrop of burning debris. It was motionless, waiting, as if deciding whether or not to finish what it had started. The Excelthar had never faced an enemy like this. They had always been the ones to strike first, the ones to dictate the terms of war. But now, they were the ones running, desperate for survival. Korthax clenched his fists. How had this happened? How had the humans, whom they had considered weak and insignificant, turned into the greatest threat the Excelthar Dominion had ever faced? On the bridge of the human warship, Admiral Riker observed the battlefield with an unreadable expression. His crew remained silent, watching the defeated remnants of the Excelthar fleet drifting away. They had won. Not just the battle, but something far greater. They had proven a point. The Excelthar were not invincible. The galaxy no longer had to live under their rule. And most importantly, humanity had made its mark. But Riker knew this was only the beginning. The Excelthar would not forget this day. They would return, stronger, more prepared, and fueled by the humiliation of their loss. This war was not over. It had only just begun. Back in the Excelthar High Command, chaos erupted. The news of the defeat spread like wildfire, shaking the very foundations of their empire. The great warlords, once confident in their supremacy, now whispered in hushed tones, struggling to comprehend the unthinkable. Never before had they faced such devastation. Never before had an enemy dared to challenge them and survive. And now, with the loss of their strongest fleet, the balance of power had shifted. For the first time in Excelthar history, fear crept into their hearts. Would this human warship be the first of many? Had they underestimated an enemy capable of toppling their entire empire? The questions hung in the air, suffocating them with the weight of uncertainty. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, a different kind of silence spread. The oppressed worlds that had long suffered under Excelthar rule watched in disbelief as reports of the battle reached them. The unstoppable conquerors, the rulers of the stars, had been defeated. Hope, something long buried and forgotten, began to stir. The humans had done what no one else had dared to do. They had fought back, and they had won. The turning point had arrived. Resistance groups, long scattered and broken, began to unite. A fire that had been smothered for centuries reignited. The galaxy was changing. And it was changing fast. As the last of the Excelsior warships disappeared into the abyss, Riker finally leaned back in his command chair, exhaling slowly. "Set course back to human space," he ordered. "We have made our statement." The crew nodded, their expressions still hardened from the battle, but there was something else in their eyes now: determination. They knew what they had done here today. They knew the war was far from over. But they had taken the first step, and that was what mattered. The human warship turned away from the battlefield, its engines glowing softly as it vanished into the darkness of space. The Excelsior Dominion had ruled through fear for generations. But now, they knew what it felt like to be afraid. And for the first time, the galaxy knew that humanity was not just another species to be conquered. They were an unstoppable force. And this war? It had only just begun. The Excelsior Dominion had ruled the galaxy for centuries, crushing civilizations under their might and spreading fear across the stars. Their war fleets had turned thriving worlds into ashes, their armies had wiped out entire species, and their name alone had been enough to make planets surrender without resistance. But all of that changed the day they met humanity. It began as a simple conflict, a mere encounter with what the Excelsior had thought was an insignificant species. But that encounter had turned into war, and that war had led to something the Excelsior had never imagined: defeat. Word of their loss spread like wildfire, reaching the farthest corners of the galaxy. Species that had once hidden in fear now watched with wide eyes. The invincible Excelsior fleet had been shattered. Their greatest warships, designed to conquer entire solar systems, had been reduced to debris floating in the void. And the ones responsible? A single human warship. One ship had changed everything. It had not just destroyed the Excelsior's forces, it had destroyed the illusion of their power. The galaxy had believed the Excelsior were unstoppable. That belief was gone now. And with it, the fear that had kept the other species in chains. Aboard the human warship, Admiral Riker stood at the bridge, his gaze fixed on the stars ahead. He had known from the beginning that this war would not be won with brute force alone. Humanity was still young compared to the ancient empires that had ruled the stars for millennia. They did not have the largest fleets or the most advanced technology, but they had something far more powerful: the will to fight, the ability to adapt, and the refusal to bow to tyranny. And now, the galaxy had seen what humans were capable of. It was no longer just a war between two species. It was a revolution. The oppressed civilizations of the galaxy were no longer afraid. They were rising. And humanity stood at the center of it all. Deep in the Excelsior homeworld, panic had taken hold of the ruling council. The high warlords, once confident in their dominance, now argued amongst themselves. Some demanded immediate retaliation, urging the deployment of every warship in their arsenal. Others, more cautious, warned that the war had already shifted. The Excelsior had ruled through fear, but fear was a weapon that worked only as long as their enemies believed they were invincible. That belief was shattered now. Even if they sent more fleets, even if they crushed humanity, the damage had been done. The galaxy had seen the Excelsior bleed, and that meant others would soon follow humanity's example. The resistance was only beginning. Across the stars, rebel forces began to rise. Worlds that had been under Excelsior control for generations started to fight back. The Excelsior found themselves facing attacks not just from humanity, but from dozens of species they had once enslaved. Their warships were being ambushed, their supply lines disrupted, their empire collapsing from within. And all of it had started with a single battle, a single defeat at the hands of the humans. What had once been an empire of fear was now an empire of desperation. Admiral Riker watched these events unfold, knowing that humanity's role in the galaxy had forever changed. They were no longer just another species among the stars. They had become a symbol, a beacon of resistance. The war was not over, and the Excelsior would not fall in a single battle. But their time was ending. Humanity had struck the first blow, and now the rest of the galaxy was following. The old order was crumbling. The age of the Excelsior was over. And a new era was beginning, an era where humanity was no longer just a name among the stars, but a force that would shape the future of the galaxy.